thank you. Now look, I'm Mike, 19 years at Marks & Spencer leading the sustainability, the Plan A journey there. Now consulting across the economy, working in the technology sector, FMCG, property sector, working with big corporates like M&S to drive things forward. But I've also been loving working with startups as well. The old man with his grey hair, getting out of his suit and working with bright young things like the team at CoGo. And to me, we're collaborating now on the CoGo Good Impact series. And what we're trying to do is put an understanding of consumption at the heart of the journey ahead on a sustainable future. I've grown up in a world where now we're consuming over 70 billion tons of stuff we're extracting from nature, from the planet, to fuel the way that we live our lives. That's turned into trillions of items, a piece of clothing, food, flights, of cars, every one of which has got an embedded impact. Every one of which needs to be dramatically reduced in the future. So consumption, understanding the future of consumption in key sectors is right at the heart of this series. And it's right at the heart of what CoGo do as well. Now, before COVID, we'd started to see some sort of welcome nudges in terms of consumption patterns. People were starting to explore a plant-based diet. They were starting to explore electric vehicles. They were starting to move away from a throwaway fashion society, using resale platforms, wearing something at least 30 times, donating to charity shops. Well, welcome, it was good, but it wasn't happening fast enough. And what COVID has shown us is that we need to move away from the current paradigm rapidly, through a lens of inequality, through carbon, through pollution, through resource use. Wherever we look, it's the end of 40 years of globalization as we know it. We need a new system. We need to build that better. Now look, none of that's going to happen, and the acceleration that we need in terms of changing consumption, without three things. The policy system, governments, rules, laws need to force out the real bad accidents, and there are many in every sector. We need to have the laws that put that minimum underpinning to the marketplace. The second thing we need to do is business to redouble its efforts to create the solutions that consumers actually want to consume. Products that are great for them, but fundamentally better for planet and people. And again, I like stories like Allbirds, a brilliant aspirational trainer, the comfiest I've ever worn in my life, but a brilliant sustainability story behind it as well. And interesting, they've just launched a carbon footprint on their products as well. But the third thing we need to do is engage the 7.7 billion citizens on this planet in changing their day-to-day behaviors around consumption. And that's what CoGo does. Through open banking data, it allows me to track every day how I'm spending my money. Is it with a business with a science-based target or paying a living wage? And then it gives me nudges and help to try and point me in the right direction to increase the amount of sustainable options that I'm buying out there in the marketplace. Over 20,000 companies part of that ecosystem now. A real good start. And it's just added a carbon footprint tool on top of that Mike, we're going to explore with Mike in a minute. He's been at the heart of sort of helping develop the tool. And just a quick reflection on my personal use of it. What it's shown has been a fantastic drop off of my carbon footprint as COVID hit. Just like the rest of the global society, Mike's carbon footprint has shrunk. So I was already doing reasonably well in terms of reusing renewable electricity, plug-in hybrid car, reducing meat consumption, making sure that I didn't buy too many clothing. When I did, I resold or recycled. Oh, you know, all good start. But even looking through the lens of COVID, there is so much more that Mike and his family need to do to deliver the genuine low carbon lifestyle that we're going to need in the future. So that's what CoGo does. And I just want to draw Mike into the conversation now. And I first became aware of Mike Berners-Lee 12, 13, 14 years ago when we were launching Plan A. Everybody in the marketplace was talking about the impact of a retailer's operations, its shops, its lorries, its warehouses, and that's significant. But it's about 5% of your total carbon footprint. The 95% enterprise value is in the supply chain or consumer use of your product. And Michael had just launched a book in 2011, How Bad Are Bananas, that really opened everybody's eyes to this hidden impact of products. So Mike has been at the forefront, through his work as a professor at Lancaster University, of understanding carbon footprints of individual products. Mike, so glad that you've joined us today. And I just want you to start with maybe just reflecting about that 10-year journey since you launched How Bad Are Bananas, what you've learned and what you think of the future of carbon footprinting and consumer products is.
Well, thank you. It's great to be here. So, you know, probably about 15 years I decided I'd sort of start working on the climate change agenda properly and full time. And I thought, well, look, you know, I won't do the carbon numbers. I'll leave those to the people who do carbon numbers, and I'll just do the organizational change stuff. And then I found you couldn't get the numbers anywhere. And the big deal was that nobody was doing a proper job of looking down the supply chains, which is where most of the carbon is most of the time. So, you know, I started doing that as best I can, and working with businesses and a supermarket chain, and you know, and it was and you know, out of all of that came How Bad Are Bananas? And then, I suppose in the 10 years since then, you know, increasingly worked with more and more businesses of every scale. And it's been a long journey. You know, 10 years or so ago, we persuaded BT that supply chain, you know, the supply chain was where their carbon was, and all hideously complicated. Actually, you know, it's not so complicated that you can't do a good enough job of looking at it and managing it. And that's actually the really important thing to do. And now they get it, Microsoft gets it. You know, the world is, you know, the world is starting to wake up properly to supply chain carbon at last. And so, you know, so two things have happened really. The first is that the kind of, you know, we've been working up the wherewithal to do increasingly better supply chain carbon numbers. You know, when I say increasingly better, supply chains are infinitely complex when you really look at them. And I mean that, you know, they are mathematically infinite. And so it's always a question of not pretending you're being accurate, but having good enough management information. You can, and you know, and that is deliverable in increasingly pragmatic and realistic ways. And the other side of the debate has been that actually, if you really look at climate change, you want to deal with it. Carbon footprints matter, that's true, but actually we need to stand right back and look at the whole thing systemically. And we even need to see climate change as one symptom of something much bigger that's going on in the world, which is that humans have become this incredibly powerful species. And we've entered this era called the Anthropocene, if you want to use a big word for it, which just means that suddenly we're the most powerful thing affecting the planet. And it means, and the implication is that we need to carry ourselves in a radically different way from anything we've ever had to do before. So there's an incredibly urgent transition needed, a big system change. And so that's what my kind of, you know, I have two projects. One is updating How Bad Are Bananas. It's been huge, huge project. But the other is updating my latest book, There's No Planet B, which is about that big system change, of which carbon footprint management on every scale is a part.
Yeah. And Mike, I love that story because, again, I work for a relatively small retailer. So Marks & Spencer sold 38,000 different product lines, 3 billion individual items from several thousand factories, none of which it owned, 20,000 farmers, none of which it owned, thousands of raw material sources, the palm oil, the soy, the cocoa, the coffee, the fisheries, etc. The number of options, even within that small supply chain, was staggering. And what I loved, what you just said there, was good enough to make management decisions. So if you start to think now about what is good enough to make decisions, what have you seen when you've been working with big business? How far down do they have to go to be able to make the right decision without going down to infinite detail at great cost?
Okay, so to give you the supermarket example, so you know, at the time when I first, you know, there was one big supermarket, very publicly spending millions and millions of pounds on product carbon footprinting, which is a good thing to do. But I went on to a much smaller supermarket chain, Booths in the Northwest, about 28 supermarkets, and said, look, for a minuscule budget in comparison, I can give you a good enough map of what's going on, break all your product supply chains down into 100 product categories. It won't be exact. We'll break all those categories down by life cycle stage. And you will be able to understand how important your different food types are, whether transport matters more than the food type itself, how important is packaging in the scheme of things, what about your operations and your electricity use, how much of the whole carbon pie is that, and you will have perspective on the whole challenge, and that, you know, that is enough, and that guides you, you know, straight away to the really big issue. So suddenly you stop worrying about minutiae. And you see that by far the biggest deal is the meat and dairy that you're selling. Which meat and dairy? Where does it come from? Are the alternatives to meat and dairy delicious? Can you nudge consumers really want a bit? And then the second biggest deal is the waste. Actually, not the supermarket's waste, but the extent to which you're encouraging your customers to be able to waste less food. You know, and then you've got questions like air freight and so on. So all of that goes into perspective. And you can do that for any kind of business. So, you know, it's a very different kind of businesses. So we work with BT and Microsoft on their supply chain carbon, which is hideously complex, even compared to a supermarket. But, you know, even there, it's possible to get good enough perspective on where the issues are and what the levers are to manage it downwards. And what are the ways in which you can try and take the whole of the tech industry? What are the ways in which a few big companies can actually bring the whole of the tech industry with them by pulling their supply chain into the carbon picture?
I mean, just expanding upon that point, Mike, I mean, think about those technology companies, because they're the dominant players, some of them valued at $1 trillion now on the stock market. What are the hotspots for them? I understand in food, refrigeration, food waste, deforestation, meat-based diet. What would be the similar 4 or 5 biggies for a tech company?
Right. Well, you know, it is a more complex picture. So it depends on. It depends if there's hardware. Then, you know, the end user devices, the manufacture of those devices is a much bigger deal than their use over their lifetimes. Yeah, the sort of whole IT global carbon footprint pie divides up into about 3 chunks. There's the end user devices, then one chunk would be networks and data centers. And then the third chunk would be what I'd be defined as the old-fashioned bit, which is the TV, TV and streaming and all, you know, all that kind of thing. So, you know, but the ways in for the ways in for tech companies are, you know, it's about the stuff that they buy, but it's about their business models. It's about the behaviors that they can move their customers into. You know, how long can you encourage people to make their kit last for example? So and questions like where they get their own, at all the stages down the supply chain, where does the energy come from? Where does the electricity come from?
Yeah. Because I sense now a lot of big businesses are starting to take the climate crisis semi-seriously. Not working up to the enormity of it yet, but semi-seriously. But there's a real risk now of greenwash as well. You know, businesses going through the motions of 1% less energy each year. What are the broad indicators that you're looking for, not just from a food company or a fashion company or a technology company, that tell you that they're serious on carbon?
Yeah, from any company, really. So, I mean, I would say that, you know, over the last 15 years, you know, I have seen so much corporate greenwash. You know, the world is plagued. Yeah. And but I think there are some companies now that, you know, are beginning to come up with, you know, trustworthy approaches, you know, that I really would rate. So what am I looking for? Well, the first thing is they've got to be looking at what the whole deal is in terms of their impact. You know, in terms of carbon, it's got to include the supply chain carbon. Also got to include a serious analysis of what their downstream impact are they selling products in a way that is encouraging people to have low carbon lives, for example? And then it's a wider question again. There are questions like, well, you know, where does all their money, where does all their influence go? You know, what are they lobbying? You know, and directly and indirectly, what kind of messages are they financing? And all of that needs a level of scrutiny. And I think one of the encouraging things is that I think it's getting harder now to get away with some of the worst and most obvious forms of greenwash that used to be commonplace. So, you know, an airline talking about an airport talking about LED lights on the runway, you know, that is just misdirection of attention, you know, and now you're much more likely to get embarrassed and flushed out for making a message like that. So the things I'm looking for are proper supply chain carbon targets, you know, that are in line with 1.5 degrees, and really clear messaging about you know, the situation the world is in, you know, clear messaging from businesses about the need for big transition right now. But one thing I've noted, you know, I think the last 18 months, even before COVID, I think the last 18 months, we have seen very encouraging signs of change, unlike anything before that, for sure. And, you know, businesses coming to me asking, how can you help us do an assessment on the extent to which we are pushing for a better world, given the state we're in? Well, that's a really big question. But perhaps even more importantly, you know, I've had asset management companies come to me now saying, can you analyze our portfolio properly for us and tell us about the carbon liabilities in it, and tell us who you think is coherently pushing for a world? These are, you know, much bigger, deeper questions being asked seriously now.
And just two or three thoughts on that, Mike, because again, this ability to have granular insight to the right level, not overly detailed, to make the right decisions, I think is critical. I think the second point about lobbying is crucial now. So we're starting to see the old days of speak with a forked tongue. Left hand says this, right hand says that, do this, is much harder, but there's still quite a bit of bullshit out there. But what I've loved about the last 6-8 weeks of COVID is the number of business alliances that have stepped forward to governments and said, we have to build that better. And you sense it's no longer what we used to have, which was just sign a letter, round robin, tick the box, move on. Business is genuinely frightened about what is happening to capitalism as we know it. Unless business finds a new accommodation with society and nature, we're in really, really tricky waters about society's trust in capitalism as we know it today. So, great change required across business.
So, the more I reflect on it, I think, I really think now has to be the moment. And you're right, we need big system change. It comes from everywhere at once, and every part of the system can help every other part of the system on. So it's about citizens looking at their carbon footprints, and also what other influence can they have? How do they influence businesses through what they buy? How do they influence politicians, not just through how they vote, but how they communicate with their politicians? How do businesses influence government? How do businesses influence their consumer? It's a whole network and web. And now we've got this green recovery, and this recovery from COVID-19, economic recovery. And we just have to make sure that every aspect of that recovery goes through the green lens, because if not now, when? It will never be easier than now to kickstart the transition in earnest.
Yeah, spot on. So look, Mike, let's go from the big world of carbon now. Let's just start to sort of bring it to life for individual sectors. We've started talking about the food sector, that's my background at M&S, I know reasonably well. But let's just start to dig down a little bit for the people listening today. What are the key things that people can start to do as individuals to cut their carbon footprint in food? And where do they need help from the system, from businesses and government to do things differently, to enable them to do it differently?
Okay, so food, for the average person, food is something like a quarter of their carbon footprint pie. And the nice thing about it is that we can all influence that, through, on a very, 3 times a day, we can all influence that. And the big deal is, the biggest deal is how much meat and dairy is there in the diet. And the science is absolutely clear cut. Whether you care about climate change or biodiversity or feeding the world, from all these perspectives, or even if you care about pandemics, actually, from all these perspectives, less meat and dairy, there's a clear-cut imperative for less meat and dairy in the world, and especially in the UK, meat and dairy, because we're quite a high, quite an animal-orientated diet. And which doesn't mean zero. So it's about cutting down, it's about choosing our meat more carefully, and it's about choosing the sourcing of those meats, because if you're going to have beef once every couple of months, then you can do a lot with the carbon footprint of that beef by sourcing it carefully. And the good news is that for us in the UK, that's very likely to be a carefully sourced piece of UK beef. So that's the biggest thing is around diet. Then the second biggest thing is around waste. We waste a frightening proportion of our food just by letting it go off in the fridge or leaving it on the plate. And then the third thing is about, just to be very simple about it, has any of your food gone on an aeroplane? Because broadly speaking, shipping food around the world has got a carbon footprint, but it's not a huge deal. It's okay to have oranges, bananas, apples from New Zealand even. But the minute it goes on an aeroplane, it's a total carbon disaster. So if food is not robust enough to travel a long way by boat, then it's going to be a carbon disaster out of sea. So apples, oranges, bananas, fantastic any time of year. Asparagus, grapes, raspberries, either have them frozen or wait until they're in season.
Yeah, and really good summary, Mike. And just let's pick on a couple of other themes within that world. I mean, clearly there's refrigeration. The refrigerant gases out there. And deforestation, particularly about palm oil and soy. I think there's a new WWF study out today saying that 7 imported commodities into our life, palm oil, soy, cocoa, leather, cattle, rubber, requires a land area equal to the size of the UK overseas to satisfy our annual consumption here. So deforestation, refrigeration, just quick thoughts on those.
Yeah, sure. So depending on how a big deal with how deforestation finds its way into our food carbon footprint is that we're eating animal-based products, and those animals are fed with feed, which has been grown on land that's had to be deforested in order to have those plantations. So when we talk about deforestation around soya, don't blame the soybean. The problem is that the soybean gets fed to an animal rather than a human. And if you feed 100 grams of soybeans to a cow, the cow will give you back about 10 grams of beef. And in those 10 grams of beef, there'll actually be less of almost every important nutrient than there would have been in 10 grams of soybeans. So there's a colossal inefficiency in all of that.
Just a real theme going on out there is this idea of lab-grown meat. So we've got a shift into a conventional plant-based diet. Good. People are now starting to talk about lab-grown in the meat, and how Rethink X postulating 50% of the US beef industry disappears in the next 10 years. What's your thoughts about the reality of the carbon footprint of food grown in the lab?
Yeah. Okay. So my first instinct is it doesn't make my heart sing. But maybe that's just about getting used to it. But I've done some sums on this, and if you look at the inherent efficiency of let's look at producing carbohydrate first. You can either have a bit of land, grow a plant on it, harvest that plant, and eat usually some of that plant. So wheat, for example, and you can get a small percentage of the sunlight that landed on that square meter of land, say a very small percentage. Fraction of a percent will find its way into energy in the form of wheat going into your mouth. Yeah. Alternatively, you put solar panels on that land and do an entirely lab-based process. And you can get something like a massive 4% of the sun's energy finding its way into carbohydrate that's ready for you to eat. That's something like a 50 times more efficient process. So if we want to feed the world and have biodiversity, and look out for climate change, then it looks like that's a much more efficient way of doing it. And the same goes with protein as well. So, I suspect that we're going to look back in 50 years' time, and most of our food won't be coming from the outdoors.
So just a quick thought on that. I mean, WWF produced a report this week looking at the carbon impact of vertical farms. So lettuce leaf grown indoors. Depending on where in the world it's produced, it could be good or for bad. All that LED lighting requires lots of electricity. If it's coming from a coal plant, that's dreadful. If it's coming from renewables, that's a lot better. LEDs, you can have a revolution in LEDs, so they can be made specifically for indoor growing. You can have a revolution in terms of the lettuce leaf that's actually happy to be grown indoors than outdoors as well. So again, lots of opportunities to innovate to make today's reasonably better systems dramatically better as well.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, I think when we talk about renewable energy systems, renewable energy supplies to drive these systems, one caveat on this is that there is actually, although solar power is a huge opportunity for us, there is actually a crunch point on this. It does take a lot of resources to make those solar panels. We're just doing the numbers on this at the moment at Small World, but it looks like, several years worth of today's greenhouse gas emissions will be required to create enough solar panels to transition our whole energy supply. So it doesn't leave us any spare to go and just say, oh, well, it's all right, we'll just put up more solar panels to drive this process. There is a crunch point on this. Yeah. Yes, I think it will be the way forward, but I think, one message that we all need to get hold of, which is not widely enough grasped at all, is that whilst I think we can make the transition to clean energy supply, I think it's totally doable. We have to constrain our total energy demand. Right? It's going up at 2.4% per year, doubling every 20 years.
And that's such an important point when we talk about consumption generally. We can't just substitute the electric car for the diesel car and then just see a traffic jam of electric cars. We need profoundly different ways of consuming.
Electric cars are better, and we need to drive less.
Yeah, absolutely. Final question on foods before we sort of delve into the rest of our carbon footprint. Farmers being paid to farm carbon. So you're being paid to lock up carbon on your land. You might be farming food on there as well. You might not be.
Yeah.
Is there a pathway to diversify incomes and take the farming community with us, because we find a different way of paying them to do something different for us?
Totally. We need really intelligent conversations about what to do with our land in the UK. You know, when to grow crops, when to put animals on it. If so, how to do those processes. When is it right to let a bit of land just go wild? When should trees be planted? If so, what kind of trees? All that stuff. And it's a very detailed conversation, especially in the UK. You know, every farm is different. Every patch of, where I live, every patch of land is different and requires a different solution. And there's uncertainty on the science that demands research. But there's also some quite good knowledge, already, that's enough to help us to get some simple things in place, like at least subsidizing. Michael Gove had a good one-liner on this, but we need to get the detail right. We need to subsidize the goods and not the bads, so that farmers can actually make a living by doing the right thing for the land. And very often that will be doing a practice that, for some bits of land, doesn't deliver food, but does deliver soil carbon, biodiversity, sequestration, all those things.
Thanks, Mike. So look, let's pivot away from foods now. Let's sort of move into the rest of a personal carbon footprint. Let's talk about mobility. I might drive, I might cycle, I might walk, public transport, I might fly. What are the key things in there I should be looking out for as an individual and doing?
Okay, so for most of us, there are two things we should think about. One is how much we drive, and the other is how much we fly. So some people don't fly at all. A lot of people don't fly at all. If you fly, a few times a year, then that's a huge deal. So, and there's no doubt about it that the world needs to fly less, and that especially applies to people in the UK. I estimated about 9% of the average UK person's carbon footprint, once you take into account high altitude effects and so on. So, it is a big deal. And whilst we've got most of the technologies for transition to the low carbon world, we absolutely just do not know how to put an aeroplane in the sky on a long haul flight without burning through something like 100 tons of liquid hydrocarbon fuel. So it's hugely high carbon, like it or not. We can still have some flying, but we absolutely need to fly less. So we just need to make careful decisions about when a flight, whether we can really justify a flight or not. That's flying. Then on to driving, and the messages are, public transport. I know COVID-19 has put a different angle on that now. But, can we travel less? Can we travel in smaller cars? Can we lift share more? Can we walk or cycle? Those are fantastic for well-being and health as well. I want to give electric bikes a mention because they've really come of age, and they open up possibilities that that weren't really around 10 years ago. I've got one arriving next week. Actually, it's going to help me with I've just moved house. It's going to be 8 miles to the station for my cycle train commute. And, I think with an electric bike, that's doable for me. 8 miles to the station, 4 miles on the other end. Yeah. So electric bikes, they turn out to be really low carbon, really sustainable. And they double at least the distance that is feasible on a daily basis.
So just a couple of themes there. I mean, I'm a keen cyclist, and I'm a little bit of a snob even at the age of 52, normal propulsion rather than that electric aid.
Yeah, me
too.
Age,
I'm going to need it soon. I hopped on an electric Brompton a few months ago. Wow, what an experience. It just glided up the hills rather than me puffing and panting and potentially in a suit to get to a business meeting. And it felt transformational if we can get people there. The aviation point, clearly, and I'm going to make a very broad leap now, all business travel by air stopped because of COVID. And we're all doing this, the Zoomy kind of thing. Do you think that's going to remain depressed demand for business flight 50%, 20%, 10%? I know it's very speculative, Mike, but is this a big change that we're going to see?
Yeah, this is a big change. I mean, if you look at flights, UK flights, actually only a fairly small proportion of them are business flights. Most of them are leisure flights. If you look at the business world, yeah, I think there's a big change. So I'm based at Lancaster University. That's got a campus in China, lots of Chinese students, all the rest of it. They are realizing that they have to make the online system work, and they're finding that they can. And all my business work, there's some things we miss about real face-to-face contact, but there's a lot that we find out that we can get by without. So I don't think I don't think the airline industry is ever going to rebuild back to where it was before, because it was starting to swim against the tide anyway. The facts were against it. I've been working with an airline pre-COVID even, looking at, how do you say it like it is, honesty as an airline. If you're going to be honest with your customers, you have to say, we're in a world where we need to fly less. So the honest proposition is, okay, but if you think you can justify your flight, then choose our airline, because we're the ones who will help you do it as responsibly as you can. And that's quite a bold message, but we have to be talking about an industry that is contracting, was due to contract quite a bit, not to nothing, but quite a bit.
And that sort of introduces the thorny topic of carbon taxes, because clearly the airlines are not paying the true cost of their impact, and that's why relative to rail travel, it looks very much cheaper, so everybody naturally gravitates to it. What should we do on carbon taxes?
Well, we absolutely need a carbon price, right? So, all sorts of things become feasible and possible when we've got a proper carbon price. Suddenly that generates the revenue that allows us to pay farmers to do the right thing with their land. It allows us, it makes it profitable to develop carbon capture, to take carbon out of ambient air we really badly need. It makes all sorts of things possible that aren't possible at the moment. And everybody thinks, a lot of us have been brought up to think, oh, tax, that must be a bad thing, it makes people poorer. That's absolutely not true. What you do with it, because tax generates a revenue which you then spend, and it creates green employment opportunities, and it enables all kinds of things that make our lives better. So a carbon tax is absolutely a key measure in this. And if you look at what it will take to leave the world's fuel in the ground without a carbon tax, it's very hard to see that happening. So we need, and it's going to be pretty serious carbon tax. I think when I say serious, I think £100 a tonne is kind of the beginnings of seriousness. It only takes about £30 a tonne for us not to want to use coking coal anymore to make steel. So, some big changes start kicking in, at lower prices than that. But the beginnings of serious really is £100 a tonne. And over the decades, I see it climbing up through the hundreds.
And why, and again, I think I know the answer to this, but why do you think governments haven't been braver in exploring a price on carbon?
I think it's partly because just the mention of the word tax prickles everybody. We need to reframe it. We really got to reframe that whole concept. And it's partly lobbying from businesses. But what's sad about this is that there's lobbying from businesses who see threats to things like leaving the fuel in the ground and carbon taxes. But there's nothing like as much and as powerful a lobbying from the industries that stand to really benefit from this. So I've mentioned the ICT industry. I mean, they really stand to benefit like mad from a carbon constrained world. But there are so many green technologies and green industries that we need to develop like crazy.
Now, look, Mike, we've got about another 10 minutes of conversation. I want to reassure the audience, you can have a good 10, 15 minutes for questions. I can see some coming in along sort of the Q&A bar at the bottom, which is brilliant. Ask any questions you want. We'll try and get to Mike at about quarter to the hour. Mike, in the sort of 10 more minutes we've got to converse, we've talked about foods, we've talked about mobility. Just take us through the other key elements of our personal carbon footprint and how we can start to affect change in them.
Okay, so most obvious one really is our home energy use, which I don't want to talk about too much because I think we hear a lot of messages there. But just to say, there are broadly two kinds of ways in which you can cut your home energy consumption and green it up. And there are the expensive things you can do. If you've got £20,000 in your pocket, you can put up solar panels and you can put pumps and you can really sort out the energy efficiency of your home, and you can put in some really quite interesting complex systems now in which you're storing energy and feeding it into the grid at key moments, or maybe storing it as heat. I mean, it's becoming very, very technical. That's one end of the spectrum. And then at the other end of the spectrum, there are the incredibly simple things you do that require no planning whatsoever, like putting a jumper on, or turning your thermostat down, or having a hot water bottle, or things like that. So there's just to say there's a spectrum of stuff on home energy. So that's 3/4 of the pie we've talked to so far, and then the rest is the everything else corner. And that's made up of, that includes all the stuff that we buy. Every time you buy a physical item, from a shop, that's got a supply chain that we don't see. It's invisible to us, and we need to tune into. And CoGo really helps us with that. So we need to tune into what might lie behind that supply chain. What about not just the carbon, the people who are involved in making it? Did they get paid properly? What was the pollution coming out of all this, and what was the carbon footprint? So, and the simple rules are to try and understand that supply chain, to buy less stuff, buy stuff that we need, get really good mileage out of it, get it mended, buy things that are high quality, get it mended, pass it on. I mean, I don't know how other people react to this lockdown, but one of the great, I love the fact I virtually haven't been in any kind of shop in the last couple of months. I mean, that for me, that's just heaven. And I like to think we're moving away from the idea of shopping as a leisure activity, because and I'd like to see our high streets opening up with places where you can get anything you can think of repaired. And if you do buy a piece of furniture, if you do find yourself buying a new piece of furniture, is our expectation that it's going to last 5 years or 100 years?
So two quick observations. I mean, one is the technology world, which has got us hooked on upgrading every 6 or 12 months because we just have to have a slightly better camera and slightly more storage. We really need it. So I'm going to ask for a view on the technology sort of redundancy issue in a minute. And then just a personal reflection on fashion. Last year the world consumed 130 billion pieces of clothing and footwear. We were heading towards 200 billion by 2030 on the old trajectory. I've been struck by the complacency of the fashion industry that never thought that single-use approach could ever be disrupted. And yet lurking, even before COVID, the resale platforms, the Depop's, the Vestiaires, the Poshmarks, the ThredUps, the Thrift Plus, were starting to eat away at conventional production. And because the high fixed costs of running an old shop network predicated on sell it once, wear it once, and throw it away so high, you only have to lose 10, 15, 20% of your sales to go bust. So I think the fashion industry teeters on the edge of really substantial reimagining in terms of physical consumption of stuff. Now, whether 130 billion becomes 100 billion or 80 billion, don't know. But a lot of businesses are going to lose a lot of money if they're wrong side of that disruption.
Yeah, I hope you're right. I mean, there are other business models out there. So, if you buy a Patagonia jacket, Patagonia guarantees to mend it for you free of charge for the rest of your life. I mean, isn't that great? And isn't that bold? But I think just to look at economically for a second. So supposing a piece of clothing to the point where it needs a little bit of a repair, and you've got a choice. You can either take it to a repair place, on your high street, and maybe pay half the price of a new garment to have it repaired, or you can chuck it in the bin and go and buy a new one. Well, if you take it to be repaired, not only are you saving some money, but also if you look at where that money goes, it goes straight into somebody in your local economy. So it's in terms of sort of rejuvenating your local area. It's dramatically more effective thing to, better way to push your money.
Yeah, and just this quick point on the tech companies, ever upgrading the phone, and we won't name individual companies because they all do it, but driving us, through once emotional hooks into us to make us feel insecure that we haven't got the latest gadget. How do we break that habit? Because marketing is right at the heart of this consumption model, isn't it?
Well, we need to be bold enough to break out of it ourselves. We need to be bold enough to be able to say, what, I'm still worth it, even if I haven't bought this, that, or the other. And if every one of us who breaks out of that and goes around with an old phone when we know we could buy a new one or whatever, we actually make it easier for everybody else. A kind of humbling quality about humans is that most of us, most of the time, like to be just like everybody else. And which means that if you do something that feels a bit weird, but you decide to do it because you've worked out it's the right thing to do, take comfort from the fact you are making it a lot easier for other people to do it after you.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. Now, look, I'm just going to pivot towards the questions that are coming from the audience. Some great questions in here. So we're going to spend 10 minutes sort of delving to these, and then we'll bring things to a conclude. The first question I want to pick up is one from Sophia Williams, who's talking about how much food is air freighted. So there's lots of aviation out there for leisure, lots of aviation out there for business travel, but hidden underneath that, there's an awful lot for goods. Food's been a good example, but there's lots of other things that move around. Where do you think we would end up? Do you think we could actually live in a world where there was no air freight of food? It was either penalised in terms of price and carbon or in terms of unacceptability in the marketplace. Could you see a world where we don't fly food?
Yeah, I really could, actually. I'm not often particularly black and white, but I don't think there's any place for air freighted food in the sustainable world. I just can't see I can't see the value for it. We don't need it from a nutritional point of view. We don't need it from a taste point of view. You know, most foodie people I know say that the out of season asparagus air freighted from Peru doesn't taste particularly great anyway. You know, and there are some good news is, you know, if you need to have raspberries in January, actually frozen raspberries turn out to be, there's a little bit of a carbon footprint on freezing them down. It's not that high, but there's a great advantage in locking that food down 2 hours after it's been picked and locking all that taste and nutrition straight away into a frozen form so that you can take your freezer exactly when you want it and use only the amount you need. I mean, it's actually quite a good way of doing food. So we don't need, we absolutely do not need air freighted food at all to have brilliant, diverse, healthy diets. So we can just ditch that one.
Just on a halfway house there, because, you know, that's a great leap. We might need to make it off next decade, but it's a great leap. What about differentiating between air freighting food in from Africa, where there is a big carbon footprint, but at least you're creating economic activity in some of the poorest parts of the world, with air freighting in from California, which frankly is rich enough? Do you think there's a halfway house?
I'm sympathetic to the idea of supporting the African economy, absolutely. But, and I think this is a wider argument about jobs, you know, all around the world, in this country, in Africa, everywhere, you know, we need to be supporting the right jobs. We need to be supporting the green jobs. And I think in the end, you do Africa a disservice by encouraging them into a fundamentally unsustainable economy, or an economy that is built around a fundamentally unsustainable world. So, you know, there are plenty of products to grow in Africa, which we can transport to other parts of the world, you know, without putting it on aeroplanes, and products that they actually need within Africa itself. You know, there are all sorts of ways of building the African economy, and air freighted food, or worse still, flowers, absolutely it.
Yeah. Thanks. I just want to touch on something again, a very good point that Georgina Goff's picked up on. We talked fleetingly at the beginning about policy interventions by government that just removes the bad stuff from the marketplace. If you were just taking away 1, 2, 3 choices now through legislation because you just can't wait for the market to deal with them over the next 10 to 20 years, they're just so bad carbon-wise, what 2 or 3 interventions would you do into the marketplace to remove some bad choices from people's lives?
Oh my goodness. Well, I would air freighted food would be up there. I think it probably, I mean, I think most of the time it wouldn't be about removing it. It would be about taxing it like crazy and subsidizing in reverse. So I would put big carbon taxes on some foods for sure. So, you know, meat and dairy, and you'd say, you know, and some meats especially. So, you know, your Brazilian beef, let's say, your UK beef, I'd tax that pretty hard. But the good news there is that gets you a source of funding that allows you to support UK farmers to absolutely thrive doing the right thing with their land.
So hypothecation. So you're taxing the bad, but you're not just putting that generally into the exchequer, you're putting it into a specific good activity.
Yeah, I think there's a strong argument for that. I think we need to break down this idea that people just see tax going into a black box and they don't understand what they get back from it. And so I think because of that, there's a really strong argument for earmarking this tax to these places.
Which takes me to a good question from Trudy Bishop, who's asking here about, you know, if we start to put a price on carbon and there's economic flows of carbon out there, won't it just be, you know, have the same murky practices from business around it about flowing it through offshore tax havens, you know, are trying to minimize the amount of tax they pay to governments through good lawyers, when actually individuals can never do that. So how do we create a very much more transparent system where we're raising it, where we're taxing the bads and subsidising the goods, as we should in the future, how do we not replicate all that's wrong with today's economic model?
Okay, so tax systems have never been perfect, and you know, just something that works most of the time. Well, I'm not saying our current financial tax system does, but you know, would be good enough. You know, the simplest, if I could apply something globally, I'd tax carbon at the point of extraction from the ground. You know, that would actually be the simplest way. You know, second to that, if you can't do that, you have to do that at the point of burning the carbon. If you're going to do that, you can do that at the UK level, but if you're going to do that, then you've got to apply it to the trade. You've got to apply it to the traded in carbon so that we don't just import all our emissions from China. So yeah, I think it's doable. I take the point, it's a challenge.
And now there's a number of questions sort of building upon this theme now, which says it's all very well sort of taxing and eliminating a bad over here. Let's just use an example, air freight of food from Africa or British beef, and then preparing the money to go across and pay for something good. But in the meantime, in the real world, thousands of people have lost their jobs. The new jobs might be created nowhere near them. We're not good as a society or an economy at joining the dots. How do we take a more strategic approach to dealing with winners and losers as we drive change in consumption?
I think this is a good conversation to have right now in terms of COVID, because you know, COVID-19, because you know, a lot of jobs have gone, and that's a desperate situation. And some of those jobs we need to bring back as they were, and some of them it's an opportunity to say, right, if we're going to have jobs, what kind of jobs, you know, what kind of jobs will be great for the economy and great for great for the environment as well, and great for society. So there's a re-engineering opportunity specifically now. I think when it comes to transition, you know, all sorts of industries, you know, go up and down over time. You know, things fade away, and horse-drawn carriages went out because cars came in. You know, we have these kind of transitions all the time. And I think the danger that we slip into is when we talk about those transitions, people understand what the job loss will be like more easily than they understand what the equal or better created jobs that will replace them will be like. So we need to spend more time fleshing that out so that people can really imagine what that green economy is going to look like, and how those will be fantastic jobs, and how they will regenerate exactly the parts of the community that are fearful of the current jobs that they might lose.
Yeah. I'm just going to leap onto the chat box, because Russ Carroll's asked a really good question about, let's say food is frozen, you think your raspberries are frozen, that's good, but actually they've secretly been air freighted, you never knew that. So, and this takes us back into the world, and I'm going to name Tesco's from 13 years ago, because Tesco's committed 13 years to carbon level everything. Just as Plan A was launched, and I think, you know, that it didn't quite work out for them, but hats off to them for being bold and ambitious and going to the heart of the consumption system, trying to do something about it. Where do we lie on carbon footprinting or any sustainability labelling of products? You talked about good enough information that allows me, the Chief Sustainability Officer at Marks and Spencer, to make some decisions behind the scenes. That's important. Where do we have to give information to the consumers to help them with this journey?
Okay, so it allows you good enough management information, provided you have a genuine intention to understand what's going on, and you're looking at it impartially, and you're not trying to cook the books in any way to, you know, to cook a story. It doesn't allow us, you know, precise numbers. So we need to view it in that vein. We will never have a world in which you can go to the shops and have a provable carbon number that your supermarket can say, this is the absolute carbon footprint of your shop. However, you can have a system which allows you, for the supermarket, to tell you, roughly speaking, what they think the carbon footprint of your shop was in broad terms, and where it thinks the hotspots were, and a CoGo app, you know, to do a similar thing for you that allows you to manage the carbon. And we can have a good enough understanding that, so, you know, companies I work with can, you know, declare that they've analyzed their supply chain carbon in a way that they don't claim to be accurate, but they do claim it's rigorous, it's impartial, and it's kind of, you know, it's an honest process. and it allows them to track, roughly speaking, the impact of their actions and the extent to which their carbon management policies are taking effect. So we've always got to take these metrics with some degree of a pinch of salt. We should take them seriously, but we should also not, we shouldn't fixate on them too hard.
A final question, but before we I ask you to wrap up, and I'll say a few words of conclude as well. Nick Lawson just wants to know when this update of How Bad Are Bananas is coming out. I know it's a labour of love, and
it's been a labour of love. So I've been in a weird situation at the moment because I've got two books that have both coming around for an update. So there's no Planet B is going to come out in autumn. That's okay. That was a fairly simple update, just a couple of years worth of things. But there's How Bad Are Bananas? 10 years old. It's full of numbers, and all those numbers interrelate with each other. And it's been an absolutely monstrous project. So that's coming out in the autumn as well. I've actually got a deadline of for the whole of the draft manuscript to deliver it in a few days' time. There's a team of 4 of us working on it now. I have a background team crunching away on numbers and checking stuff. I mean, it's been monstrous.
Well, it makes us appreciate having time. I do want to give you an opportunity just to bring your thinking together to share with the audience, what are the 3, 4, 5 key personal interventions they could make now to drive down their personal carbon footprint. But before you do that, I'll have a go at this as well. I just want you to name 2 or 3 companies that you think are doing some really interesting stuff to tackle carbon through a consumption lens. So I'll mention 3 companies because I think what they're trying to do is show that their low carbon product is a superior product. So I think Tesla's trying to tell you can have a high performance sports car that is much greener than the diesel, the petrol you normally use. I mentioned Allbirds earlier, saying you can have a stylish shoe that is also fundamentally less impactful in terms of carbon. I like what Quorn have done to really sort of differentiate. They have used the carbon label on a very specific product. They don't have a broad product mix, just on one. They're 3 products. I'm not saying they're perfect. I'm just saying they interest me, and I'll be watching to learn from over the next 12 months. Who are the 3 that you're looking at, really thinking that's interesting?
So in clothing, and these guys have been brilliant for decades, but you'd have to pull out Patagonia as the sustainable clothing brand. Just a brilliant business model, and they are really thinking hard about how can the whole of this business be orientated in every way to push for the kind of world that we'd like to see. And it's that holistic approach, and really committed and bold. I would hold them up. IKEA's making some interesting forays into things like getting furniture repaired. The idea that you can send it back and they'll repurpose it into something else, even if they can't repair it. The idea of making things, so that it lasts better. It's a much more circular economy, experiments into a much more circular economy model than they had a little while ago. Genuinely impressed me. OVO, home energy company, are impressive, and there are other good energy companies as well. Good Energy and Ecotricity, good. But we're really talking about how they can get their whole customer base to be net carbon neutral, in not many years' time. And then we haven't talked about money at all, and how we back is really important. Every time you put money somewhere, you invest or you put it in a bank or anything, you are pushing for one world or another. So I'd probably Triodos Bank are well worth a mention.
And thank you for adding that, because that was something that we should have probably spent a little bit more time on in terms of helping people make choices. So look, I'll wrap up in a second. I want you to just give us some observations about the 3, 4, 5 steps an individual can now take coming off this call. We've talked about some big things, some complicated things. What are the 2, 3, 4 practical things you would advise people to do?
Okay, so in terms of carbon footprint, it's food, and within that we've talked about diet and waste. Transport is all about driving less electric cars, not flying if you can help it, and so on. Those would be probably for most people, and less stuff. I think the other thing I want to say for individuals is that sustainable living, we need big system change, and all of us have to ask, how can we push for that? And we have opportunities in our workplace. We can influence our politicians. Possibly most challenging, our friends and our families. How can we influence them without falling out with everybody? But we need to be asking the question, right? Not just how can I cut my impacts, but how can everything I do be pushing for the big system change that I want to see happening?
Yeah, thank you. So look, Mike, you've been brilliant. I mean, you've given up precious time when you're rushing to finish that book. I can't thank you enough for being sort of the first interviewee on the CoGo Good Impact series. Really, that has just been, we could have carried on another hour, and I was learning all the time, even as an old man of the industry. I think in summary for me, it is complicated, of course it is, but we have to solve it. And consumption drives our total global carbon footprint. We have to find a way of not just making what we have today a little less bad. We now need a profoundly different relationship with our food, our energy, and our finances as well. I think people like CoGo and another little business I'm working with called Climate that's helping people invest their money ethically as well. Fintech startups are starting to empower tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, then millions of individual people to make the right choices. And why this is important to me as somebody from a big corporate, I look at signals. I don't need everybody in the world to tell me that sustainability is important. I know I need enough to say that's where the marketplace is going, and I need to innovate and get ahead of it. And it's the same with policymakers. They're looking for a sniff out there that said the electorate's interested. And every time you spend your money better, every time that you challenge and ask for change, you're sending a signal to big business and big government that this matters. And boy, do we need change going forward. So look, I wanted to thank you personally. You've been fantastic. Thank you to the CoGo team for hosting us today. And thank you to all of you as participants for joining us today. Go out there, play with the CoGo app, see if it can help you change your behavior as well. And keep being a brilliant leader for help us build back better. Thank you, everybody. That's the end.